The movie begins with a disturbing demonstration at Oxford University. A professor presents a case of so-called female hysteria on Eliza Graves before a room full of students. Though Eliza insists she is perfectly sane, the professor provokes her hysteria by touching her inappropriately, triggering her into a violent frenzy. It becomes clear that any human touch sends her spiraling into uncontrollable distress. After humiliating her for the class, the professor coldly calls for the next patient. The story then shifts to Christmas Eve, where a young doctor from Oxford, Edward Newgate, arrives at the imposing Stonehurst Asylum. He is escorted inside by guards led by the gruff Mickey Finn. The asylum, Edward is told, houses over 200 patients, most of them men and women from Britain's most distinguished families. Edward has come here to gain practical clinical experience for his medical training. He is soon introduced to the asylum's superintendent, Dr. Silas Lamb, a confident, charismatic figure who takes an immediate interest in Edward's enthusiasm for working with the mentally ill. Pleased, Lamb invites him to join his afternoon rounds. Together, they meet patients suffering from a wide range of conditions. Some believe they are animals, others live in delusions, and some are locked away simply for their sexuality. But one patient instantly captures Edward's attention, Lady Eliza Graves, the very same woman he had seen earlier in Oxford. She is the daughter of a noble family, married into great wealth, but condemned to Stonehurst after biting off the ear of her abusive husband. Her father had her committed under the diagnosis of hysteria. Lady Eliza is unable to tolerate physical contact of any kind, yet Edward is captivated by her presence, her beauty, and especially her hauntingly beautiful musical talent. Despite her mistrust of men, she seems quietly drawn to him as well. Edward is intrigued by Dr. Lamb's philosophy of treatment. Rather than attempting to cure his patients, Lamb allows them to embrace their conditions, encouraging them to live happily within their own realities. It is a radical approach, one Edward both admires and questions. That evening, Dr. Lamb invites Edward to a formal dinner. The dining table is adorned with elegant dishes and fine wine, but Edward is startled when he sees that the guests are the patients themselves. Dr. Lamb explains that blending patients with polite society is therapeutic and part of his new system. The atmosphere is at first cheerful, but when Edward casually remarks that Mickey Finn is a rather amusing name, an uncomfortable silence falls over the room. Suddenly, Finn bursts into wild laughter, then offers Edward a drink. Edward is about to take a sip when he feels a sharp kick under the table. It is Lady Eliza, wordlessly warning him. He sets the drink aside, pretending to spill it on his shirt. Using that excuse, Eliza discreetly leads him out of the dining hall. Her face is pale with urgency as she whispers that he must flee the asylum immediately. She refuses to explain further, only insisting he leave while he still can. Shaken and confused, Edward returns to his quarters, quietly loading his pistol in case of danger. But a loud noise outside draws him out. He follows the sound deep into the asylum's bowels, down into the dark, damp basement. To his shock, he finds several people locked behind bars, desperately begging for his help. At first, Edward assumes these are violent patients. But as he speaks with them, the horrifying truth dawns on him. These are not patients at all. They're the real staff of Stonehurst Asylum, imprisoned during a mutiny. Among them is the true superintendent, Dr. Benjamin Salt, along with nurses, guards, and attendants. They explain that Dr. Silas Lamb is not a doctor at all. He is a patient who orchestrated a coup, drugged the staff, and locked them in the cellar. Now the asylum is being run entirely by the inmates, with Lamb as their self-appointed leader and Mickey Finn as his brutal enforcer. Edward realizes too late. The world above is upside down, and he has walked straight into the heart of madness. Edward realizes with a chill that if Lady Eliza hadn't intervened during the dinner, he would have ended up locked in the basement with the others. Horrified, he runs to tell her the truth about Lamb and the imprisoned staff, but she isn't surprised. Eliza already knows. In fact, she admits she was one of those who helped Lamb overthrow Dr. Salt and imprison the staff. The following day, Dr. Lamb takes Edward and Mickey Finn with him on his afternoon rounds. He instructs Edward to change the dressing of a particularly terrifying patient. As Edward cautiously approaches, the man suddenly lunges at him and begins choking him. Edward struggles for his life until he notices the word Arthur scrawled on the wall. Desperate, he calls the man by that name. To Edward's relief, the patient immediately calms down. Lamb is impressed by Edward's quick thinking, but Edward walks away bruised and battered. Lady Eliza tends to his injuries, and it is during this tender moment that Edward reveals his plan. He wants to free the real staff and escape with them. But Eliza stops him. She explains what Stonehurst used to be under Dr. Salt. The asylum was not a place of healing. It was a chamber of horrors. Dr. Salt believed a patient's madness could only be cured by confronting their worst fear. His methods were nothing short of torture. He used cruel water treatments, locking patients under heavy pressure for days. He tormented Lamb with endless experiments, trying to discover his greatest fear. And with Eliza, he deliberately touched her inappropriately, triggering her hysteria, all under the guise of treatment. Lamb, Mickey, Finn, Eliza, the guards, the cooks, every one of them had been victims of Salt's sadistic practices. They had suffered for years until they finally united, drugged the staff's drinks, and locked them in the cellar. Lamb assumed Salt's position as superintendent and gave the patients a new life. He allowed them to live freely, even assigning them roles as cooks, gatekeepers, and nurses, giving their existence purpose. For the first time, Stonehurst became a place of laughter rather than screams. Edward listens, shaken. He promises Eliza she will never suffer that way again. Slowly, his genuine kindness begins to shine through the asylum. When an elderly woman refuses to eat until her son returns from war, Edward pretends to be her son and gently feeds her. The simple act touches everyone who witnesses it, especially Eliza. Against her better judgment, she begins to fall in love with him. Edward, equally smitten, urges her to escape with him, but Eliza hesitates, torn between hope and fear. Not long after, Dr. Lamb summons Edward. He wants him to assist in a therapeutic procedure on none other than Dr. Salt. Bound to a bed, Salt insists he is the rightful superintendent of Stonehurst. Lamb declares this to be madness and says the cure is electrotherapy. Before Edward's horrified eyes, Lamb throws the switch, electrocuting Salt. He then demands Edward do the same. Salt convulses under the current until finally his mind breaks, leaving him an empty shell with no memory of who he once was. The next day dawns with the promise of a new century. It is New Year's Eve, 1900, and Stonehurst celebrates with music, dancing, and champagne. The patients laugh and cheer under the stars, while Lamb observes proudly, as though presiding over his kingdom. But Edward has different plans. He intends to free the prisoners tonight. Searching for a glimmer of humanity in Lamb, Edward sneaks into his old patient's room and discovers a photograph hidden behind the wall, a fragment of Lamb's past. While everyone gathers outside to toast the new century, Edward stays behind. He slips into the dining room and begins spiking the champagne with a chemical that will knock everyone unconscious. Just as he's about to finish, a shadow looms over him. Mickey Finn has caught him in the act. Edward manages to break free from Mickey Finn during their struggle, but not for long. The champagne he spiked is carried to the grand celebration. Glasses are raised. And just as everyone is about to drink, Finn storms in and exposes Edward's scheme. The party freezes. Dr. Lamb smashes a bottle over Edward's head, and everything fades to black. When Edward wakes, he is strapped to a hospital bed, being wheeled into the dreaded electrotherapy room. Lamb announces that Edward will receive the same treatment as Dr. Salt. Just then, Eliza enters the room holding Edward's pocket watch. Inside it is her picture. She is convinced that Edward's husband sent him here to rescue her. She demands to know his true reason for coming to Stonehurst. Edward confesses. 6 months ago, during a lecture, he watched in horror as Eliza was displayed before a class, humiliated under the guise of medical science. He pitied her deeply and swore to save her from such torment. That, he explains, is the only reason he came. As the staff will him closer to the machine, he begs Eliza to escape while she can. Moments before the switch is pulled, Edward makes one final request, that Eliza be given the photograph in his pocket. But instead of her picture, he has slipped in the photo he discovered hidden in Lamb's room. When Lamb sees it, his composure shatters. The image drags him back into the trauma that birthed his madness. The battlefield where, as a military doctor, he shot his own comrades to spare them suffering, then failed to turn the gun on himself when the bullets ran out. That guilt broke his mind, and the photograph of one of those fallen soldiers tears open the wound once again. Lamb bolts from the room, raving, leaving Edward to Finn. Seizing the chance, Mickey Finn decides to finish the procedure himself. Eliza leaps to Edward's defense, but Finn forces a hand on her, striking the sensitive spot that triggers her hysteria. She convulses into a violent frenzy, but Edward manages to calm her, steadying her mind with his voice. Then he turns on Finn. The two men clash savagely until Finn is thrown against the machine and electrocuted, his body burning as the fire spreads through the room. Chaos erupts. Eliza rushes to free the real staff still locked in the basement, while Edward goes in search of Lamb. He finds him wandering the hall, lost in delusion. Instead of abandoning him, Edward guides Lamb outside, joining the others as the asylum begins to collapse in flames. At last, the nightmare seems over. Edward pleads with Eliza to leave with him, to start a new life far from Stonehurst. She refuses, torn between gratitude and fear, but they share a final kiss. Edward whispers that he still has one secret left to tell. Months pass. Stonehurst is rebuilt under its rightful staff. Nurse Pike runs the institution with care, while Dr. Salt and Lamb now live as patients. One day, the Oxford professor who first presented Eliza in that cruel lecture arrives with her wealthy husband to release her. But the nurse informs them she was discharged weeks ago by Dr. Edward himself. The professor stiffens. He is Dr. Edward Newgate, the real one. He explains that the man who impersonated him was actually a patient suffering from pseudologia fantastica, or pathological lying. He stole Edward's identity, fled his own asylum, and infiltrated Stonehurst, not for greed or malice, but because he believed he had to rescue Eliza Graves. The final scene shifts to Tuscany, Italy. In the gardens of a peaceful asylum run by nuns, Eliza dances with the imposter who now calls himself Dr. Edward Lamb. They smile, laugh, and embrace as though the world has given them a second chance.